At the center of it all stood Andrew Whitmore, the heir to Whitmore Industries, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that exuded both wealth and control. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate glittered like a dream, its high, vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate chandeliers casting golden light over the polished marble floor. Charleston's elite mingled in clusters, their conversations peppered with laughter and the occasional clink of champagne flutes. But Andrew didn't feel in control. Not tonight. From the far corner of the room, his mother, Madison Whitmore, watched him like a hawk. Her gaze, as sharp as the diamonds on her necklace, silently urged him to fulfill his duty. He knew what she wanted. A formal announcement of his engagement to Evelyn Montgomery, the carefully chosen daughter of a politically influential family. The Whitmores and Montgomerys merging through marriage was a match made in societal heaven, but to Andrew it felt like a trap. Evelyn stood a few feet away, chatting effortlessly with guests. Her dark green dress hugged her figure perfectly, and her polished smile could have graced the cover of any magazine. She embodied perfection in every way, but Andrew could feel the coldness beneath the charm. To her, this was a business arrangement, and to him, it was suffocating. Andrew, Madison's voice, low yet commanding, cut through his thoughts. She approached him, her posture elegant but firm. "It's time." "Time for what exactly?" Andrew replied evenly, though his jaw tightened. He already knew the answer. "Don't play coy," Madison said, her voice laced with expectation. "Evelyn's father is here. The press is watching. You need to make the announcement." Andrew took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the room. Everywhere he looked, he saw judgment, expectation, obligation. This was his life, a carefully curated path laid out by his family, with no room for deviation. Then his gaze fell on her. A waitress moved through the crowd with quiet determination, balancing a tray of empty glasses. Her auburn hair was tied back into a loose bun, and though her black and white uniform was unremarkable, something about her presence stood out. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, her green eyes flicking across the room with a mix of focus and quiet strength. She didn't belong here, not among these polished, curated people. And yet she moved with a confidence that made her seem untouchable. Andrew's lips curled into the faintest smirk. An idea, wild, reckless, and desperate, began to form in his mind. He set down his untouched glass of champagne and began walking toward her. Kiana Bennett froze as the tall, sharply dressed man approached her. She had noticed him earlier, standing near the center of the room, looking every bit the powerful heir this crowd revered. Now his piercing gaze was locked on her, and the intensity in his stride made her pulse quicken. "Excuse me," she began, unsure of what he wanted. "Can I help you with—" Before she could finish her sentence, Andrew reached for her hand, gently but firmly pulling her tray away and placing it on a nearby table. His grip was warm, and his voice, when he spoke, was low and steady. "Come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kiana blinked, stunned. "I'm sorry, what? Who do you think you are?" Andrew didn't answer. Instead, he guided her through the crowd, his movements deliberate yet calm, ignoring the murmurs and raised eyebrows that followed them. Kiana wanted to protest, to pull away, but the sheer audacity of the moment and the crowd of Charleston's elite now staring at them froze her in place. When they reached the center of the ballroom, Andrew stopped, turning to face her. His eyes softened for just a fraction of a second, as if silently apologizing for what he was about to do. Then, without warning, he cupped her face with both hands and kissed her. Gasps rippled through the room like a tidal wave. Champagne glasses paused mid-air, and whispers erupted as the crowd collectively tried to process what they had just witnessed. Kiana stood frozen, her mind spinning. The kiss was brief, but deliberate, a statement more than an act of passion. When Andrew pulled back, he wrapped an arm around her waist, holding her close as he turned to face the crowd. His voice rang out, confident and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words cutting through the stunned silence. "Allow me to introduce Kiana Bennett, the woman I love." Kiana's jaw dropped. "What?" she hissed under her breath, trying to push him away. Her face burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. "Are you insane?" "Trust me," Andrew whispered, his tone firm yet urgent. "Just go with it." Kiana had no time to respond before the crowd erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, and the sound of murmured speculation filled the air. Somewhere near the edge of the room, Madison's expression hardened into a mask of icy fury. Evelyn, meanwhile, stood motionless, her carefully composed smile faltering as the truth, or what she thought was the truth, hit her. "I'll explain later," Andrew murmured to Kiana, his grip on her tightening as he steered her toward the nearest exit. She didn't resist this time. Her thoughts raced as she struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this man, and why had he dragged her into his world in the most public and humiliating way possible? By the time they reached the garden outside, the cool night air hit Kiana's flushed cheeks like a shock. She finally yanked herself free from Andrew's grasp, glaring at him with a mixture of anger and confusion. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. "You think you can just kiss me and announce to the world that I'm your girlfriend? What kind of game are you playing?" Andrew raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his expression unreadable. "I know this looks bad." "Bad?" Kiana interrupted, her voice rising. "This is a disaster. I'm a waitress, not some pawn in your twisted rich boy drama." Andrew's calm facade cracked for the first time, a flicker of desperation flashing in his eyes. "I didn't mean to drag you into this, but I didn't have a choice. You were the only person in that room who wasn't a part of their world. I need your help." Kiana crossed her arms, her fury barely contained. "Help? With what exactly?" Andrew took a deep breath, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "It's complicated, but let me make one thing clear. I'll make this worth your while, financially." Her heart sank. Of course. This was about money, just like everything else in this world. Kiana shook her head, disbelief washing over her. "You think you can buy me?" "No," Andrew said, his voice softer now. "But I can help you. I know you're in a tough spot, and I'm offering you a way out. Just give me a chance to explain." Kiana stared at him, torn between the urge to slap him and the flicker of curiosity his words sparked. She had no idea what kind of chaos this man had just unleashed in her life. But one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. Kiana slammed the door of her small apartment shut, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Her hand lingered on the doorknob as she tried to steady herself, but the scene from the ballroom kept replaying in her mind. The kiss, the crowd's whispers, the look on that man's face, the mix of confidence and desperation in his eyes. She finally let go of the door and leaned against it, her head tilting back as she stared at the cracked ceiling. "What just happened?" she muttered to herself. She was no stranger to unpredictable moments. Life had thrown plenty her way since her parents passed, leaving her to care for her younger brother, Luke. But this was something else entirely. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. Kiana walked over and picked it up, her stomach sinking when she saw the notification. A news alert. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The headline made her heart sink further. "Andrew Whitmore stuns Charleston with surprise romance." She groaned, tossing the phone back onto the counter. Of course, the media had jumped on it. She'd just become the center of attention in a world she didn't belong to. Before she could process the mess her life had suddenly become, a firm knock on her door startled her. "Kiana, open up," came a voice she instantly recognized. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. What was he doing here? After a moment's pause, she yanked the door open, her glare sharp enough to cut steel. Andrew stood in the dim hallway, his tailored suit slightly wrinkled, though his expression remained composed. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Can I come in?" he asked, his tone calm but insistent. "Number, say what you need to say and leave." Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I owe you an explanation. What happened tonight?" "Was insane," Kiana interrupted. "You pulled me into your mess without asking. Do you have any idea what that kind of attention could do to someone like me? I'm not part of your world, and I don't want to be." "Which is exactly why I need you," Andrew said, his voice firm. "I didn't pick you at random. You're different. You don't belong to that crowd, and that's what makes you believable." Kiana blinked, her anger momentarily replaced by confusion. Believable? For what? Andrew stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I need you to pretend to be my girlfriend for 6 months. Just until I can get my family off my back about Evelyn and this ridiculous marriage they're forcing on me." Kiana stared at him, trying to process his words. "You're out of your mind." "Maybe," Andrew admitted, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I'm also serious. Look, I know this is a lot to ask, and I wouldn't involve you if I had another choice. But you're the only one who can pull this off." "Pull what off?" she shot back. "Fooling your entire family? The press? That woman you're supposed to marry?" Andrew nodded. "Exactly, and I'll make it worth your while." Kiana narrowed her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I know you're struggling," he said bluntly. "I looked into your situation. Your brother, the debt. I can fix it. All of it. Just say yes." Her breath caught. She hated how accurate his words were, hated that he thought he could fix her problems with money. But the truth was, he wasn't wrong. Her chest tightened as she thought about Luke, how hard she'd worked to keep things afloat for him. 6 months, she said finally, her voice soft but tinged with disbelief. "That's all you need?" Andrew nodded, his eyes locking with hers. 6 months, and then you can walk away." Kiana hesitated, torn between her pride and the possibility of a way out of the endless grind she'd been stuck in. She stepped back, leaving the door ajar, and gestured for Andrew to enter. The weight of his proposition pressed on her as she watched him survey her small apartment. His presence felt out of place here, his tailored suit and polished demeanor starkly contrasting with the modest surroundings. "All right," Kiana said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the counter. "You've got 5 minutes to explain why I should even consider this." Andrew took a seat on the worn sofa, resting his elbows on his knees. He seemed to choose his words carefully before speaking. "This isn't just about me avoiding an arranged marriage," he began. "It's about control. My family, especially my mother, wants to dictate every part of my life, who I marry, what I do, even how I feel. For once, I want to take control of my choices. And tonight, when I saw you," he paused, his gaze steady, "I knew you were the answer." Kiana raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Because I'm expendable?" "No," Andrew said firmly, his tone shifting. "Because you're real. You're not tied to their world, and you don't care about impressing them. That makes you unpredictable, and unpredictability is what I need right now." She exhaled slowly, her skepticism softening slightly. "And what's in it for me, besides a front-row seat to the circus that is your life?" Andrew leaned back, his expression confident yet sincere. "A clean slate. I'll pay off your debts, cover your brother's school tuition, and give you enough to start over once this is done. 6 months of pretending, and you'll never have to struggle again." The words hung in the air, tempting and heavy. Kiana bit her lip, her mind racing. It was too good to be true, and she knew better than to trust someone who thought money could solve everything. But then there was Luke, sitting at home with textbooks he couldn't afford, dreaming of a future that felt out of reach. This deal could change everything, for him, if not for her. "What's the catch?" she asked finally. "There's always a catch." Andrew smiled faintly, as if he'd expected the question. "The catch is that you'll have to deal with my family, the press, and Evelyn. None of them are going to make this easy for you. But I'll be there to help. You won't be doing this alone." Kiana stared at him, her arms tightening across her chest. The idea of stepping into his world terrified her, but it also ignited something inside her, a chance to fight back against the hand life had dealt her. 6 months, she repeated, as if testing the words. "And after that I walk away, no strings attached?" "Exactly," Andrew said, standing. "Once it's over, you'll be free." Her throat tightened as she considered the implications. Everything about this felt wrong, but the alternative, continuing to struggle, watching Luke sacrifice his dreams, felt worse. She let out a sharp breath and looked Andrew in the eye. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'll do it. But let's get one thing straight. This is strictly business. You don't interfere with my personal life, and I don't become part of yours. Got it?" Andrew extended a hand, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Deal." Kiana hesitated before shaking his hand, sealing a pact that felt more dangerous than either of them could fully understand. As Andrew left, the apartment felt quieter than usual, almost heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Kiana sank into a chair, her thoughts swirling. She'd just agreed to step into a world she didn't belong to, with no idea of what lay ahead. But if there was one thing she knew for sure, it was that this decision would change her life. Forever. The Whitmore mansion loomed ahead, an imposing structure of white columns and sprawling balconies framed by meticulously manicured gardens. Kiana sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Andrew's sleek black car, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She'd spent the drive replaying their earlier conversation, questioning her sanity for agreeing to this. Now, as they approached the estate, the full weight of what she'd committed to settled over her like a storm cloud. "You don't have to look so terrified," Andrew said, glancing at her with a faint smile. "Just follow my lead." "Easy for you to say," Kiana muttered, her voice tinged with irritation. "This is your world, not mine." "Correction," Andrew said as the car rolled to a stop in front of the grand entrance. "For the next 6 months, it's our world. Own it." Before she could respond, a valet opened her door. Kiana stepped out, her simple black dress feeling woefully inadequate against the backdrop of luxury surrounding her. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled from the mansion's open doors. Andrew offered her his arm, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. The gesture felt strange, intimate even, but she reminded herself that this was all part of the act. As they walked up the steps, her heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to keep moving. Inside, the mansion was even more breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting a warm glow over the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. Waiters glided through the room with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, their movements as polished as the marble floors. Kiana caught sight of Madison Whitmore almost immediately. The matriarch stood near the fireplace, her posture regal, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the room. When her eyes landed on Andrew and Kiana, her expression barely flickered, but Kiana felt the weight of her scrutiny nonetheless. "Showtime," Andrew murmured, giving Kiana's arm a reassuring squeeze before leading her toward his mother. "Andrew," Madison said, her tone cool but polite as they approached. Her eyes flicked to Kiana, taking in every detail with clinical precision. "And this must be—" "Kiana," Andrew said smoothly, his voice full of warmth that Kiana suspected wasn't entirely genuine. "Mother, I'd like you to meet my girlfriend." Madison's smile was thin, calculated. "Kiana, what a lovely name. And what brings you into Andrew's life?" Kiana swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Madison's gaze. "We met at a gala," she said, keeping her tone steady. "I guess you could say it was fate." Madison's lips twitched, though whether it was amusement or skepticism, Kiana couldn't tell. "Fate," she echoed, her tone unreadable. "How charming." The conversation was interrupted by Evelyn's arrival. Her emerald green gown shimmered under the chandelier's light, and her perfectly styled hair framed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Andrew," she said sweetly, though her gaze was locked on Kiana. "And who is this?" Kiana braced herself as Evelyn's scrutinizing gaze swept over her. The other woman's smile was sharp, almost predatory, and Kiana could feel the unspoken judgment in her eyes. She tightened her grip on Andrew's arm, forcing herself to stand taller despite the growing knot of unease in her stomach. "This is Kiana," Andrew said, his tone calm yet firm. "My girlfriend." "Girlfriend?" Evelyn repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Her eyes flicked back to Kiana, her smile widening in a way that didn't feel remotely friendly. "Well, Andrew, you've certainly surprised us all." "She does that," Andrew replied smoothly, his tone hinting at a playful fondness that made Kiana's cheeks flush. "It's one of the reasons I'm so drawn to her." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but her smile didn't waver. "How fascinating. And what do you do, Kiana? I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting before." "I'm in hospitality," Kiana said evenly, refusing to let Evelyn's tone unsettle her. "Though I suspect it's not the kind of hospitality you're used to." Andrew chuckled softly, drawing attention back to himself. "That's another thing I admire about her. She's refreshingly grounded." Madison's gaze shifted between Andrew and Kiana, her expression unreadable, but clearly calculating. "Well, Kiana," she said after a long pause, "it's lovely to meet you. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to get to know each other better." The words felt less like an invitation and more like a challenge, but Kiana simply nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "Likewise, Mrs. Whitmore." Madison's lips twitched in what might have been a smile before she turned her attention to a passing server, effectively ending the conversation. Andrew took the opportunity to steer Kiana away from his mother and Evelyn, leading her toward the quieter corner of the room. "Not bad," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You handled that better than I expected." Kiana shot him a sidelong glance, her voice equally quiet. "Is this how it's going to be for the next 6 months, smiling through thinly veiled insults and pretending I belong here?" Andrew's expression softened slightly. "It'll get easier," he said. "And for what it's worth, you did more than just belong. You held your own." Kiana wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or irritated by his words, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Evelyn watching them from across the room, her expression carefully neutral, but her gaze undeniably piercing. "She's not going to let this go," Kiana said, nodding subtly in Evelyn's direction. "She won't," Andrew agreed, his tone serious. "But that's my problem to handle, not yours." Kiana raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Because it feels like she sees me as a very big part of the problem." Andrew didn't deny it, but the look in his eyes was one of quiet determination. "Let her play her games. The more she tries to push you out, the more convincing our story will look." The confidence in his words was reassuring, but Kiana couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn was far from their only obstacle. If tonight was any indication, the road ahead would be anything but smooth. As the evening wore on, Kiana found herself drawn into conversations with several guests, each one seemingly more curious about her than the last. Some were polite, others less so, but all carried an undercurrent of skepticism. It was clear they were trying to place her, to figure out how someone like her had ended up on Andrew Whitmore's arm. By the time the night came to an end, Kiana felt drained. The constant smiling, the careful words, the endless scrutiny. It was exhausting. As they walked back to the car, she let out a long breath, finally allowing the tension to leave her shoulders. "You survived," Andrew said with a faint smile as he opened the car door for her. "Barely," Kiana muttered, sliding into the seat. "Is it always like this?" Andrew's smile faded slightly as he settled into the driver's seat. "It's worse," he admitted, "but tonight was just the beginning." Kiana didn't respond, her mind racing with everything she'd experienced. She'd agreed to this arrangement thinking it would be a simple transaction, a way to fix her problems and move on. But now she wasn't so sure. The stakes felt higher than she'd anticipated, and something told her the challenges ahead would test her in ways she hadn't expected. As they drove away from the mansion, the glow of its lights fading into the distance, Kiana stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty. She was in too deep now to back out, but the question lingered in her mind. How far was she willing to go to keep up the facade? The Whitmore mansion was deceptively quiet in the morning, the kind of stillness that felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Kiana sat at the small breakfast nook in Andrew's penthouse, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The events of the previous evening swirled in her mind like the steam rising from her cup. She had survived her first test in his world, but just barely. The weight of Madison's sharp gaze and Evelyn's thinly veiled hostility lingered like an invisible scar. Andrew walked in, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt with the sleeves casually rolled up. He looked far more relaxed than she felt. "Morning," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against the counter. "How are you holding up?" Kiana shrugged, not looking up. "I'm here, aren't I?" "That you are," Andrew replied with a faint smirk. "And for what it's worth, you did better than expected last night." She finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Better than expected? That's not exactly a glowing review." "It wasn't meant to be," Andrew said with a casual shrug. "This isn't a game, Kiana. My family will dissect every word, every action you take. The fact that you walked out of there without losing your cool, that's a win." Kiana didn't respond immediately. She knew he was right, but the idea of being constantly scrutinized made her stomach churn. "So, what's next? Do I have to attend another one of your social gauntlets, or can I breathe for a day?" Andrew's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Actually, there is something we need to talk about. Evelyn isn't going to let this go. I wouldn't be surprised if she's already digging into your past." Kiana's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, digging into my past? What is she looking for?" Andrew set his cup down, his expression unreadable. "Anything she can use to discredit you. Financial struggles, family history, even something as small as a parking ticket. She'll twist it into something bigger. It's her way of asserting control." Kiana felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "So what? I'm supposed to sit back and let her drag my name through the mud?" "No," Andrew said firmly. "That's why we're going to get ahead of her. I have someone looking into your background as well, just to make sure there's nothing she can exploit." Kiana's jaw tightened. "You're having me investigated? Think of it as protecting you." Andrew said, his tone careful but unyielding. "This isn't just about you anymore, Kiana. If she finds something and uses it against you, it'll unravel everything we've worked to build." The words stung more than she cared to admit. "You mean everything you've worked to build?" she muttered, pushing back from the table. "I didn't ask for any of this, remember?" Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right, you didn't. But you agreed to it, and now we're in this together, whether you like it or not." Before Kiana could respond, her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, frowning at the unknown number. "Hello? Kiana Bennett?" The voice on the other end was smooth but formal, with a faint undertone of authority. "My name is Roger Calloway. I'm a private investigator, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about your connection to Andrew Whitmore." Kiana's heart dropped at the mention of Andrew's name, and her grip on the phone tightened. She forced herself to remain calm, though her mind raced with possibilities. "I'm sorry. Who did you say you were?" she asked, buying herself time. "Roger Calloway," the man repeated, his voice steady. "I've been hired to verify some details regarding your background. It's a standard precaution for someone entering a high-profile relationship like yours with Mr. Whitmore." Kiana glanced at Andrew, who had stopped mid-sip, his sharp eyes focused on her. "I don't think I have anything to say to you," she replied curtly. "I understand your hesitation," Calloway said smoothly, as though he'd anticipated her response. "But I should warn you, if you don't cooperate, the rumors will only grow worse. It's in both your best interests to be transparent." She hung up without another word, her pulse hammering in her ears. Setting the phone on the counter, she met Andrew's gaze, her expression a mixture of frustration and fear. "Someone's already digging into me," she said, her voice low. Andrew frowned, his calm demeanor replaced with a flicker of concern. "Did they say who hired them?" "No," Kiana replied, shaking her head, "but I don't think it takes a genius to figure out." "Evelyn," Andrew muttered, his jaw tightening. "She's moving faster than I expected." Kiana threw her hands up in frustration. "What am I supposed to do? She's going to find something. Maybe not anything big, but enough to twist into something humiliating. I don't stand a chance against her." Andrew stepped closer, his voice softening. "Yes, you do. You just have to trust me." "Trust you?" Kiana let out a hollow laugh. "You're the one who dragged me into this mess in the first place." "And I'll be the one to get you through it," Andrew said, his tone firm. "You're not in this alone, Kiana. I won't let Evelyn destroy you." Kiana looked away, her chest tightening. Part of her wanted to believe him, but the stakes felt impossibly high. "So, what now?" she asked after a long pause. "Do we just wait for her to ruin my life?" "No," Andrew said, shaking his head. "We fight back. I'll make sure my team stays one step ahead of her. And in the meantime—" He hesitated, as though weighing his next words carefully. "There's something else you need to know." Kiana crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. "What?" Andrew took a deep breath, his expression unusually serious. "My mother isn't just suspicious of you because of Evelyn. She has her own reasons. Last night I overheard her talking to one of our family's lawyers. She's investigating something about your past, too." Kiana felt the air leave her lungs. "What does that even mean? What could she possibly be investigating?" Andrew hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. "I don't know all the details yet, but it might have something to do with your family history. Something that doesn't add up." Kiana's pulse quickened, her thoughts spiraling. She'd always known there were gaps in her family's story, things her parents had never fully explained before they passed. But the idea that Madison Whitmore might have discovered something sent a chill down her spine. "You think she knows something about me that I don't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's possible, Andrew admitted. But if she does, we'll find out what it is. Together. Kiana wanted to argue, to push back against the tidal wave of uncertainty crashing over her. But the look in Andrew's eyes stopped her. He wasn't just trying to protect his plan. There was something deeper there, something that almost resembled genuine concern. Fine, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. But if this backfires, I'm done. I'm not going to let your family tear me apart. They won't, Andrew promised, his voice unwavering. Not as long as I'm here. The tension between them lingered as the conversation ended, but the silence was far from comforting. Kiana knew this was only the beginning of a much larger storm, one that could change everything she thought she knew about herself and the people around her. As Andrew turned back to his phone, presumably to mobilize his team, Kiana stared out the window, her mind a chaotic swirl of fear and determination. If Madison was digging into her past, there was no telling what she might uncover. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The sprawling garden of the Whitmore estate was alive with the hum of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. Guests wandered through the maze of flowering hedges and marble statues, their designer gowns and tailored suits blending seamlessly into the opulent surroundings. It was the Whitmore's annual charity auction, an event that drew Charleston's most influential figures under the guise of philanthropy, but served more as a showcase of wealth and power. Kiana stood near the edge of the garden, gripping a glass of sparkling water so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her black cocktail dress, selected by Andrew's assistant Amelia, fit her perfectly, but it did little to make her feel at ease among the sea of affluent strangers. Every glance, every subtle whisper seemed to be directed at her, and the weight of their scrutiny pressed down on her like an invisible force. Andrew appeared at her side, his presence grounding her slightly. "Relax," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're doing fine." "I don't feel fine," Kiana replied through clenched teeth, her gaze darting toward a group of women who were blatantly staring at her from across the lawn. "They're all looking at me like I'm some kind of science experiment." "They're curious," Andrew said with a faint smile, though his eyes betrayed his own tension. "Let them stare. It'll only make our story more convincing." Kiana shot him a sidelong glance. "You keep saying that, but convincing who? Them or your mother?" Andrew's smile faltered, and he didn't answer right away. Instead, he straightened his posture as Evelyn approached, her emerald gown shimmering in the golden light of the setting sun. Her smile was as polished as ever, but the edge in her eyes was unmistakable. "Andrew," Evelyn greeted smoothly before turning her attention to Kiana. "And Kiana, I'm so glad you could join us tonight. The auction wouldn't be the same without you." Kiana forced a polite smile, even as her stomach twisted into knots. "It's a beautiful event," she said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Evelyn tilted her head, her smile widening just enough to reveal its insincerity. "I couldn't agree more. The Whitmores always know how to make an impression, don't they? Speaking of which." She paused, her gaze locking on Kiana with unsettling precision. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed a little out of place last night. Tell me, do you attend many events like this?" The question was laced with condescension, but Kiana refused to flinch. "Not as often as I'd like," she replied, her tone cool. "But I'm learning quickly." Andrew's hand settled lightly on the small of Kiana's back, a subtle show of support that didn't go unnoticed by Evelyn. "She's doing more than learning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She's thriving." Evelyn's smile tightened, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped. "How wonderful," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm sure you'll fit right in." As Evelyn excused herself to mingle with other guests, Kiana exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. "Does she ever stop?" she muttered under her breath. "Not until she gets what she wants," Andrew said grimly. "And right now, what she wants is to see you fail." Kiana turned her attention back to the crowd, her mind racing with Evelyn's thinly veiled jab. It wasn't just about her fitting in, it was about Evelyn maintaining control. She didn't know what Evelyn was planning, but the tension in the air made it clear that this was only the beginning. "Stick with me," Andrew said quietly, guiding her toward a group of donors clustered near the grand fountain. His voice held an edge of determination. "The more we show them we're untouchable, the less ammunition they'll have." Kiana followed his lead, forcing a smile as Andrew introduced her to the group. They exchanged polite greetings, their questions hovering in that uncomfortable space between curiosity and skepticism. She fielded their inquiries with as much grace as she could muster, deflecting when needed and leaning into Andrew's practiced charm when the spotlight grew too bright. But even as she navigated the conversations, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She scanned the crowd, her eyes landing on Madison. The Whitmore matriarch stood on the veranda, her gaze locked on Kiana like a hawk sizing up its prey. A chill ran down Kiana's spine, but she quickly averted her eyes, unwilling to give Madison the satisfaction of seeing her falter. As the evening progressed, Kiana found herself drifting toward the quieter edges of the garden. She needed a moment to breathe, away from the relentless scrutiny. The soft hum of the crowd faded as she wandered toward a secluded corner, the sound of the fountain masking her footsteps. "Trying to escape?" The voice startled her, and she turned to find Jack Whitmore leaning casually against a stone pillar. His dark suit was slightly rumpled, and the faint smirk on his face hinted at mischief. "Not escaping," Kiana replied, crossing her arms. "Just taking a break." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Smart move. These events can be suffocating if you're not used to them. And judging by the way Evelyn's been circling you all night, I'd say you're getting the full initiation." Kiana sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Does it ever get easier?" Jack chuckled softly. "Number. But you learn how to play the game. That's what it's all about for people like them. Games and power plays." She hesitated before speaking. "And you? Are you playing the game too?" His smirk faded slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. "Not exactly. Let's just say I'm more interested in watching the board than moving the pieces." Before Kiana could press further, a sharp voice called out from the garden path. "Kiana, there you are." Madison's tone was polite, but the undercurrent of authority was impossible to miss. Kiana straightened instinctively, her pulse quickening as Madison approached. Jack gave her a brief nod, his expression unreadable, before slipping back into the shadows. "Kiana," Madison said smoothly, her sharp gaze sweeping over her. "I was hoping we could have a word in private." Kiana swallowed hard, her heart pounding. There was no polite way to refuse. "Of course," she said, keeping her tone steady. Madison gestured toward a quiet alcove, and Kiana followed, her nerves fraying with each step. Once they were alone, Madison turned to face her, her expression as inscrutable as ever. "I wanted to speak with you about your involvement with Andrew," Madison began, her words measured. "You've made quite an impression, though I can't say I'm entirely convinced." Kiana met Madison's gaze, refusing to back down. "I suppose that's understandable. Trust isn't built overnight." Madison's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Very true, but trust must also be earned. And if you're going to be a part of this family, you'll need to prove yourself." Kiana felt the weight of Madison's words settle over her like a heavy cloak. She wasn't sure what Madison knew or suspected, but it was clear the woman wasn't going to make this easy. "I understand," Kiana said carefully, "and I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm worthy of your trust." Madison tilted her head slightly, as though appraising her. "We'll see," she said simply, before turning and walking away. As Kiana watched her leave, a sense of unease settled deep in her chest. She'd survived another test, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The evening had shown her just how ruthless this world could be, and she knew she'd need more than Andrew's support to navigate the challenges ahead. Kiana's mind churned with unease as she stood by the window of Andrew's penthouse, staring at the city skyline. The encounter with Madison from the charity auction replayed in her head on an endless loop. Madison's carefully chosen words, the faint smile that didn't reach her eyes, it all felt like a veiled threat. She couldn't shake the feeling that Madison was holding something back, something critical. Andrew entered the room, his tie loosened and his expression unusually tense. He held his phone in one hand, scrolling through messages with a furrowed brow. "You've been quiet," he said, glancing at her. "Everything okay?" Kiana turned to face him, crossing her arms. "Your mother. She's digging into my past, isn't she?" Andrew hesitated, his silence confirming her suspicion. He set his phone down and approached her. "She's thorough," he admitted, "but this isn't about finding dirt on you. She's trying to understand if you're a threat." "A threat?" Kiana scoffed. "I'm not even close to being a threat. I'm just someone who got roped into this ridiculous arrangement." "That's exactly why she's wary," Andrew said, his tone serious. "You're unpredictable. You're not from this world, and that makes you harder to control." Kiana let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "So what? She's trying to scare me into leaving?" Andrew shook his head. "It's not about scaring you. It's about control. If she can't control you, she'll try to control how the world sees you." Kiana's stomach twisted at the thought. She already felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing the weight of expectations, scrutiny, and her own self-preservation. The idea of Madison shaping a narrative against her was almost too much to bear. Before she could respond, Andrew's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, his frown deepening. "It's from Jack," he said, picking up the phone. "He wants to meet. Says it's important." "Jack?" Kiana asked, her brow furrowing. "Why would he want to meet with you?" Andrew didn't answer immediately. Instead, he typed out a quick reply before slipping the phone into his pocket. "He's always been the black sheep of the family," Andrew said. "But he's also got a way of uncovering things the rest of us can't. If he says it's important, it probably is." Kiana hesitated before asking, "Do you think it has anything to do with me?" Andrew met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. But whatever it is, we'll handle it." Later that evening, Kiana found herself seated across from Jack in a dimly lit corner of a quiet cafe. The contrast between the upscale surroundings she'd grown accustomed to and this understated meeting spot was jarring, but it felt oddly appropriate. Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he stirred a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Andrew sat beside her, his posture tense. "You said you had something important to share," he prompted, his tone clipped. "What's going on?" Jack let the silence hang for a moment before leaning forward, lowering his voice. "Your mother isn't just investigating Kiana's past out of paranoia. There's more to this than you realize." Andrew's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Jack slid a folder across the table, his movements deliberate. I managed to pull some records from an old contact. They're related to Kiana's birth, well, what's on paper at least. Kiana's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the folder. "Why would you look into my birth records?" "Because your name has come up in conversations it shouldn't have," Jack said, his voice calm but weighted. "Your connection to Andrew is only part of the equation. There's a reason Madison is so invested in you." Kiana hesitated, glancing at Andrew before cautiously opening the folder. The documents inside were a mix of birth records, hospital files, and legal forms. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as she flipped through the pages, her pulse quickened. Certain sections were redacted, and the dates didn't quite match the ones she knew from her parents' stories. "This doesn't make sense," Kiana said, her voice barely above a whisper. These dates are wrong." "They're not wrong," Jack said, his tone laced with certainty. "They've been altered. Someone went to great lengths to hide your true origins, Kiana. And my guess, Madison has known about it for a long time." Andrew stiffened beside her, his expression darkening. If that's true, why wouldn't she say anything? What would she have to gain from keeping it quiet? Jack shrugged, his gaze sharp. "That's what you need to figure out. But whatever the truth is, it's big enough to make her nervous. And when Madison Whitmore is nervous, people get hurt." Kiana felt the room spinning around her. Her entire life, she'd believed she knew who she was, where she came from. Now, it felt like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. "I need answers," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine when I don't even know who I am." Andrew placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Jack nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Be careful," he warned. "The Whitmore family doesn't like losing control, and if Madison thinks you're digging too deep, she won't hesitate to push back." As they left the cafe, the weight of the folder in Kiana's hands felt heavier than it should have. The documents were only the beginning, a small glimpse into a much larger web of secrets. But one thing was clear. Her connection to the Whitmores wasn't a coincidence, and whatever the truth was, it had the power to change everything. Kiana sat on the edge of her bed in Andrew's penthouse, the folder Jack had given her spread out across the duvet. The dim light from the bedside lamp cast long shadows over the pages, emphasizing the redacted sections and mismatched dates. No matter how many times she read through the documents, the pieces refused to fit together. Her chest tightened as she ran her fingers over the edges of a faded hospital record. She'd always known her parents were protective of certain details about her early life, but she'd chalked it up to their need for privacy. Now those omissions felt like glaring holes in her identity. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Andrew stepped inside, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "You've been quiet," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Any luck making sense of all this?" Kiana shook her head. "It's like trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. The more I look at it, the less I understand." Andrew moved closer, taking a seat beside her. His presence, solid and reassuring, provided a momentary relief from the storm in her mind. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "If anyone can uncover the truth, it's you." Kiana let out a bitter laugh. "What if the truth isn't something I want to find? What if it changes everything I thought I knew about myself?" Andrew reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Then we deal with it. Together." His words settled over her like a blanket of warmth, but before she could respond, Andrew's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. "It's my mother," he said, swiping to answer. Kiana tensed as Madison's voice filtered through the line, sharp and commanding even from a distance. "Andrew, I need you at the estate. Now." "What's going on?" Andrew asked, his tone wary. "There's been an incident," Madison replied, her words clipped. I'd rather explain in person. Andrew exchanged a glance with Kiana before responding. I'll be there soon. As he ended the call, Kiana felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. What kind of incident? She asked. Andrew shook his head. I don't know, but it's not like her to sound rattled. Whatever it is, it can't be good. Kiana hesitated before speaking. Should I come with you? Andrew considered this for a moment before nodding. Yes, if this involves you, which it probably does, you need to hear it firsthand. The ride to the Whitmore estate was cloaked in an uneasy silence. Andrew kept his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw tight as though bracing for whatever awaited them. Kiana sat beside him, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her purse. Every turn brought them closer to the estate, and with it, a growing sense of dread she couldn't shake. When they arrived, the estate was unusually quiet. The grand facade of the mansion, normally glowing with life, seemed eerily subdued. Madison met them at the entrance, her expression unreadable, but her posture rigid with tension. Thank you for coming so quickly, Madison said, her voice clipped but controlled. Her eyes flicked briefly to Kiana before returning to Andrew. We need to talk, privately. Andrew stepped forward, his tone firm. If this involves Kiana, she stays. Madison's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded after a moment. Fine. Follow me. She led them to the study, a room steeped in dark wood and heavy leather furnishings that seemed to absorb the light. As soon as the door clicked shut, Madison turned to face them. Earlier today, someone attempted to access private family records, she said, her tone sharp. Sensitive documents, ones that should never have been compromised. Andrew frowned. Compromised how? And by whom? We don't know yet, Madison admitted, though the flicker of anger in her eyes suggested she had her suspicions. But the timing is far too coincidental to ignore. Kiana felt her stomach twist. You think it has something to do with me? Madison's gaze snapped to her, piercing and unrelenting. It's no secret that your presence has stirred questions. Whether you're directly involved or not, your connection to this family has made us vulnerable. Vulnerable? Andrew interjected, his tone laced with disbelief. You're acting like Kiana is some kind of threat. She's not the one digging into our family records. Isn't she? Madison countered, her voice cold. Or perhaps someone on her behalf? Kiana felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her ground. I haven't done anything, and I don't need to. You've made it clear from the start that you don't trust me, but I'm not the one with secrets to hide. Madison's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Andrew stepped between them. Enough, he said, his voice firm. If this is about the records, then we need to figure out who's behind it, not waste time pointing fingers. Madison exhaled sharply, as though reining in her temper. Agreed. I've already set measures in motion to identify the culprit. In the meantime, her gaze lingered on Kiana. You should both tread carefully. There are forces at play here that neither of you fully understand. With that, Madison dismissed them, leaving Kiana and Andrew to navigate their way back through the silent halls. The weight of her words hung heavily between them, unspoken but undeniable. What now? Kiana asked quietly as they stepped into the cool night air. Andrew looked at her, his expression a mix of determination and frustration. Now, we find out what she's not telling us. Because if she's this on edge, it means there's something big she's trying to keep buried. Kiana nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever secrets the Whitmore family was hiding, she wasn't going to let them remain in the shadows, not when they had the power to upend her entire life. Kiana sat in the corner of Andrew's study, her eyes scanning the pages spread across the desk. The documents Jack had provided were now joined by other records Andrew had managed to retrieve from his contacts. Old property deeds, legal agreements, and hospital files, all hinting at a hidden narrative that was just out of reach. The more she read, the more the threads began to intertwine, forming a story she couldn't quite piece together. Andrew stood by the window, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low, urgent tones. His posture was tense, his free hand clenched into a fist at his side. Whatever conversation he was having wasn't going well. Kiana's attention shifted back to a faded birth certificate, her fingers tracing the name written on the yellowed paper. It wasn't hers. Not exactly. The name listed was similar but subtly different, and the birth date was off by several days. She couldn't ignore the growing certainty that something about her origins had been deliberately altered. Andrew hung up the phone with a sharp sigh, turning to face her. "That was Jack," he said, his voice tight. "He's found more inconsistencies, but nothing concrete yet. Whatever this is, it's been buried deep." Kiana leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. "Your mother knows more than she's letting on," she said. "She practically admitted as much when we were at the estate." Andrew nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm not surprised. My mother's always been good at keeping secrets, but this one feels different. It's not just about protecting the family, it's about protecting herself." Kiana frowned. "What do you mean?" Andrew hesitated, his expression clouding with doubt. "I've seen this before," he admitted. "When I was a kid, there was a scandal involving one of my father's business deals. My mother went to extraordinary lengths to control the narrative, even when it meant cutting ties with people she once trusted. She's ruthless when it comes to preserving the family's reputation." Kiana's stomach churned at the thought. And now she's doing it again. Only this time, I'm the one caught in the crossfire. Andrew crossed the room, his gaze locking with hers. "You're not in this alone," he said firmly. "Whatever she's hiding, we'll uncover it. And if it involves you, we'll make sure the truth comes out on your terms, not hers." Before Kiana could respond, Andrew's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's Jack," he said, answering the call. "What did you find?" Kiana watched as Andrew's face shifted from focused to alarmed, his grip on the phone tightening. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "All right. Send me everything you have." When he hung up, Kiana stood, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Andrew exhaled slowly, his shoulders tense. "Jack found something," he said. "It's about your adoption. It wasn't legal." Kiana's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean it wasn't legal?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I was adopted. My parents always told me I was adopted. Are you saying they lied to me?" Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "Not necessarily. Jack thinks your parents may not have known the full story either. He found records indicating that the hospital you were born in was involved in irregular practices." "Irregular practices?" Kiana repeated, her voice rising. "What does that even mean?" Andrew sighed, pulling up a file Jack had just sent to his phone. "It means there's a possibility you weren't adopted through legitimate channels. The hospital may have been involved in baby trafficking, selling infants to desperate families under the guise of adoption. Your name and birth records, they might have been altered to cover it up." The room spun around her. Kiana gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. "That can't be true. My parents, they loved me. They wouldn't have done something like that." Andrew's expression softened. "I don't think they knew, Kiana. From what Jack found, most of the families involved were misled. They were told the adoptions were legal, that the children were orphans or abandoned." Tears pricked at the corners of Kiana's eyes, but she blinked them away, her mind racing. If this is true, if my adoption wasn't legal, then what? What does it mean for me now? Andrew hesitated before answering. It means we have to keep digging. If Madison knows about this, and I think she does, she might be using it as leverage. There's a reason she's so invested in your past. Kiana shook her head, her voice breaking. But why? Why would she care so much about me? Andrew stepped closer, his gaze steady. Because you might be more connected to this family than either of us realized. Kiana stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. Connected how? Andrew hesitated, clearly weighing his words. Jack found another document, a hospital log from the same week you were born. There's a record of another infant, a baby girl who was reported missing. That baby's mother was my mother. Kiana's world tilted, the weight of Andrew's words crashing over her like a tidal wave. You're saying Madison thinks I'm her daughter? Andrew nodded slowly. It's possible. The dates match up, and the discrepancies in your record suggest someone went to great lengths to keep the truth buried. If Madison suspects you're the daughter she lost, it would explain why she's been watching you so closely. Kiana staggered back, her mind reeling. The idea was too much to process, too impossible to believe. I can't. This doesn't make sense. My entire life, I've believed one thing about who I am, and now you're telling me it might all be a lie? Andrew reached for her hand, his grip grounding her. I know this is overwhelming, but we'll figure it out. We'll get answers. Kiana pulled her hand away, her voice shaking. And what if I don't want the answers? What if finding out the truth only makes everything worse? Andrew didn't respond immediately. Instead, he met her gaze, his expression filled with determination. Then you decide what to do with it, but either way, you deserve to know. Kiana closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. The room felt too small, the walls closing in around her. Her world, already fragile, was crumbling beneath her feet. But deep down, she knew Andrew was right. The truth, whatever it was, had to come out. Kiana stood at the threshold of the Whitmore estate, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The enormity of what she'd learned, what she might represent, hung over her like a dark cloud. Every instinct told her to turn around and run, to leave this web of secrets and lies behind. But something stronger, a need for clarity and closure, drove her forward. Andrew stood by her side, his hand resting lightly on her back in a silent gesture of support. Are you ready for this? He asked, his voice low but steady. No, Kiana admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't think I ever will be. With that, they stepped through the grand front doors. The mansion felt colder today, its usual grandeur overshadowed by the tension crackling in the air. A butler led them to the study, where Madison sat behind a large oak desk, her sharp gaze already fixed on them as they entered. She didn't rise, but her presence filled the room, her posture as composed as ever. Kiana, Madison said, her tone polite but distant. Andrew, this is unexpected. Andrew didn't waste time on pleasantries. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm, about Kiana, about what you've been hiding. Madison's expression didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Hiding? I'm not sure what you mean. Kiana stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. Don't lie to me, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. You've been digging into my past. You've known something about me that I don't. It's time you told me the truth. For the first time, Madison's composure wavered. She leaned back in her chair, her lips pressing into a thin line. You don't understand the complexity of what you're asking, she said carefully. The truth is not always easy to accept. Try me, Kiana shot back, her voice rising, because right now I'm standing here questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. If you have answers, I deserve to hear them." Madison's eyes flicked to Andrew, who gave a small nod, his jaw tight. After a long pause, Madison exhaled slowly, as though the weight of the world was resting on her shoulders. "Fine," she said finally, "but once I say this, there's no going back." Madison stood, moving to the window overlooking the sprawling Whitmore estate. Her back was to them as she spoke, her voice quieter but no less commanding. 25 years ago, I gave birth to a baby girl. She was born at Whitmore General, a hospital we trusted, but there were complications during the delivery. I was unconscious for hours, and when I woke up, they told me my daughter had died. Kiana felt the air leave her lungs. She had expected revelations, but nothing like this. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the story. Madison continued, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "It wasn't until years later that I heard whispers, rumors that the hospital had been involved in illegal adoptions. Infants taken from their mothers and sold to families willing to pay the right price. I dismissed it at first. I wanted to believe the people we trusted wouldn't do something so vile." She turned to face them, her expression hard, but tinged with something almost vulnerable. "But when you came into Andrew's life, Kiana, I couldn't ignore the similarities. Your age, your background, the way you carried yourself, it was like looking at a ghost." Kiana's voice trembled as she spoke. "So, what? You think I'm your daughter? That I was one of those babies taken from the hospital?" Madison nodded, her jaw tightening. "I had a DNA test conducted on a personal item of yours that was left at the estate. It confirmed my suspicions. You are my biological daughter." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Madison's words settling like a lead blanket. Kiana's mind reeled. She wanted to deny it, to reject the notion that her life could be upended so completely. But a small, undeniable voice in the back of her head whispered that it all made sense. The gaps in her history, the inconsistencies in her adoption records. Andrew placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Kiana," he said softly, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't even know what okay means anymore," she said, her voice cracking. "My parents, the people who raised me, they're the only family I've ever known. And now you're telling me that they might have been part of something terrible?" Madison stepped closer, her gaze softening. "I don't believe your parents knew," she said. "From what I've uncovered, most of the families were deceived. They were told the adoptions were legitimate, that the children had no families to return to. But the people behind it, they knew." Kiana's tears spilled over, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, grief, and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she demanded. "Why let me go through all of this without knowing the truth?" Madison's composure cracked, just slightly. "Because I wasn't sure how to tell you," she admitted. "I didn't know if you'd want to hear it. And I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean for both of us." Kiana looked away, her chest heaving with the effort to contain her emotions. She felt Andrew's hand squeeze her shoulder, grounding her just enough to keep her from falling apart completely. "This changes everything," she whispered. Madison nodded. "It does, but it doesn't have to destroy everything." The words hung in the air, fragile and tentative, as if any sudden movement could shatter them. Kiana didn't respond, too overwhelmed to process what was being asked of her. She didn't know how to reconcile the life she'd lived with, the truth she was being asked to accept. And yet, deep down, she knew there was no escaping it. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. Kiana sat alone on the steps of the Whitmore Estate's garden, the soft hum of the nearby fountain doing little to calm her racing thoughts. The weight of the revelation from Madison hung heavily on her, a truth that had shattered everything she believed about her life. Her parents, the people who had loved her, raised her, given her everything, were not the beginning of her story. And now this new reality, one tied to the cold, calculating world of the Whitmores, loomed over her like a storm cloud. Andrew approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the gravel path. He hesitated for a moment before sitting beside her, his usual confident demeanor softened by concern. "I thought you might want some air," he said, breaking the silence. Kiana didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Andrew," she said, her voice trembling. "Everything feels wrong, like my entire life wasn't real." "It was real," Andrew said gently. "The people who raised you, they're still your family. None of this changes the love they gave you." "But it does change everything else," Kiana countered, finally turning to face him. "Who am I now? Am I Kiana Bennett, the girl who grew up in a tiny apartment with parents who scraped by to give me a good life? Or am I Kiana Whitmore, the daughter of a woman who lives in a mansion and controls everything she touches?" "You're both," Andrew said simply. "You're the person you've always been. And now you have the chance to decide what that means going forward." Kiana let out a shaky breath, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to answer. Before she could speak again, the sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. Madison emerged from the garden's shadowed archway, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now," Madison said, stopping a few steps away. "But we need to talk." Kiana stood, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Talk about what? About how you've been watching me, testing me, keeping the truth from me this whole time?" Madison's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I deserve that," she admitted, "and you deserve answers. That's why I'm here. To answer your questions, to tell you everything, no matter how difficult it is." Andrew rose, glancing between them. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked Kiana softly. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, please." Madison gestured toward a stone bench near the fountain, and the three of them sat in a tense semicircle. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken words and emotions that threatened to spill over. "When I lost you," Madison began, her voice steady but quiet, "I thought my world had ended. They told me you were gone, that there was nothing I could do. I believed them because I didn't have a reason not to. But when the rumors about the hospital started circulating years later, I couldn't ignore them. I started digging, but every path I followed seemed to lead to a dead end. Until you appeared." Kiana's throat tightened as she listened, the anger she'd been holding on to softening slightly in the face of Madison's raw honesty. "And what now?" she asked. "What am I supposed to do with this? Just pretend like everything's fine? Like I can just step into this life?" Madison shook her head. "I don't expect you to do anything you're not ready for. But you deserve to know the truth about where you come from, about who you are. What you do with that truth is entirely up to you." Kiana sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the ripples in the fountain's water as Madison's words settled over her. The truth Madison had laid out felt both overwhelming and incomplete, like she was only just beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. Her emotions swirled, anger, confusion, grief, and an ache she couldn't quite define. "So that's it?" Kiana finally asked, her voice quiet but firm. "You found out I might be your daughter, and instead of coming to me, you kept it to yourself. You tested me, judged me, like I was some sort of stranger who didn't deserve the truth." Madison's composure cracked for the briefest of moments, her shoulders sagging slightly. I didn't know how to tell you, she admitted, her voice soft. I was afraid of what it might mean. For you, for me, for this family. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me? Kiana's voice rose, the anger she'd been holding back spilling out. From what? The truth? You've been protecting yourself, Madison, not me. Andrew stepped in, his voice calm but firm. She's right, he said, his gaze fixed on his mother. You've spent so much time trying to control everything, to manage every piece of this family's image, that you've lost sight of what really matters. This isn't about you or the Whitmore name. This is about Kiana. Madison flinched slightly at the rebuke, but didn't argue. Instead, she turned to Kiana, her expression softer than Kiana had ever seen it. You're right, she said, her voice low. I let my fear and my need for control cloud my judgment. I should have come to you sooner, and I should have trusted you to decide what to do with the truth. Kiana looked away, the raw sincerity in Madison's tone catching her off guard. She wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the righteous fury that had carried her this far. But there was something in Madison's eyes, something fragile, almost pleading, that made it impossible to completely shut her out. Before Kiana could respond, the sound of footsteps on the gravel path interrupted the moment. They all turned to see Evelyn approaching, her expression sharp and determined. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I hope I'm not interrupting, Evelyn said, her tone clipped. But I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. Andrew's jaw tightened. What do you want, Evelyn? Evelyn's gaze flicked to Kiana, her smile cold and calculating. Oh, I'm not here for you, Andrew. I'm here for her. She took a step closer, her heels crunching against the gravel. You must be feeling pretty smug, Kiana. Finding out you're the long-lost Whitmore daughter must be quite the fairy tale for someone like you. Evelyn, Andrew warned, his tone low. Don't. Evelyn ignored him, her focus locked on Kiana. But let me give you a reality check. Being a Whitmore isn't just about fancy parties and a big house. It's about power, about legacy. And if you think for 1 second that you can walk in here and claim what's mine, you're sorely mistaken. Kiana stood, her anger flaring anew. I didn't ask for this, she shot back. I didn't ask for any of it, but I'm not going to let you intimidate me. Evelyn smirked, a sharp, humorless thing. We'll see about that, she said, before turning on her heel and stalking back toward the house. The tension Evelyn left in her wake was palpable, and Kiana let out a long, shaky breath. Is it always like this with her? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Andrew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She's not going to stop, he admitted. But neither are we. Madison stepped closer, her voice quieter now. Evelyn doesn't represent this family. She never has, and she never will. Whatever you decide, Kiana, know that you have a place here if you want it. Kiana didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back to the fountain, her thoughts a tangled mess. She still didn't know what her place was, or if she even wanted one. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Kiana stood in front of the grand mirror in Andrew's penthouse, adjusting the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist. Tonight was another event, a Whitmore family board meeting turned cocktail reception with a handful of powerful figures expected to attend. This time, however, the stakes felt impossibly high. It wasn't just about appearances anymore. It was about proving to herself and everyone else that she belonged, not because of her connection to the Whitmores, but because of her own strength. Andrew stepped into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. You look incredible, he said, his tone warm but steady. Are you ready? Kiana glanced at him through the mirror, her reflection betraying the nerves she'd tried so hard to suppress. Ready, as I'll ever be," she replied, smoothing down the sleek black dress Amelia had chosen for her. Andrew moved closer, standing beside her and meeting her gaze in the mirror. "Whatever happens tonight, just remember, you don't have to prove anything to them. You're already stronger than most of the people in that room." She gave him a faint smile, appreciating the sentiment, but not entirely believing it. "Let's just get through this," she said, turning to face him. "One battle at a time." The drive to the Whitmore estate was quiet, the tension between them palpable. Kiana couldn't help but replay the events of the past few days in her mind: Madison's confession, Evelyn's cutting remarks, and the growing realization that her life was no longer her own. By the time they arrived, she felt like a tightly wound coil, ready to snap. The estate was alive with activity. Cars lined the driveway, and clusters of guests mingled in the glowing light spilling from the grand windows. Andrew guided Kiana through the crowd, his hand resting lightly on her back as they entered the main hall. As expected, Madison was waiting near the entrance, her posture regal and her expression unreadable. She greeted them with a polite nod, her eyes lingering on Kiana for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm glad you made it," she said, her tone measured. "There are people here who are curious to meet you." Kiana's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm sure they are," she replied evenly. Madison raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "Stay close to Andrew," she advised, "and remember, appearances are everything." As Madison moved away, Kiana let out a slow breath, her grip tightening on Andrew's arm. "This feels like walking into a lion's den," she muttered. "It is," Andrew said simply, his tone grim. "But you're not alone." The evening unfolded with a tense rhythm, each conversation a delicate dance of pleasantries and subtext. Kiana found herself at the center of countless curious gazes, each one weighing, measuring, judging. But she held her ground, answering questions with calm precision and refusing to let the whispers faze her. Then came Evelyn. Evelyn approached with her signature air of confidence, her emerald gown shimmering under the soft glow of the chandelier. Her smile was as sharp as ever, though her eyes carried a glint of something darker. Determination, perhaps, or malice. Kiana braced herself, knowing this encounter was inevitable. "Well, if it isn't the woman of the hour," Evelyn said smoothly, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Kiana, I must say, you've certainly caused quite a stir in such a short amount of time." Kiana straightened her posture, meeting Evelyn's gaze without flinching. "It seems that way," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "Though I suspect that says more about this family than it does about me." Andrew suppressed a smirk beside her, clearly impressed by Kiana's composure. Evelyn's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, tilting her head slightly. "Perhaps. But being in the spotlight comes with its own set of challenges. I hope you're prepared for what that entails." Kiana didn't miss the underlying threat in Evelyn's words, but she refused to let it intimidate her. "Challenges don't scare me," she said evenly. "I've faced my fair share, and I'm still standing." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, her smile tightening. "We'll see about that," she said before turning her attention to Andrew. "I trust you'll keep her in check tonight. The last thing this family needs is another scandal." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "Kiana doesn't need me to keep her in check," he said calmly. "She's perfectly capable of handling herself." Evelyn let out a soft, humorless laugh. "If you say so." With that, she excused herself, her departure leaving a chill in the air. Kiana exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "She's relentless," she muttered. "She's desperate," Andrew corrected, "and that makes her dangerous." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and small talk, each interaction more exhausting than the last. Kiana felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing the expectations of the Whitmore name with the overwhelming pressure to prove herself. But as the night wore on, something shifted within her. The more she engaged with the guests, the more she realized that she wasn't as out of place as she'd feared. She could hold her own in this world, even if she didn't entirely belong to it. Toward the end of the night, Madison approached her once again, this time with a glass of champagne in hand. "You've done well tonight," she said, her tone softer than before. "Better than I expected." Kiana met her gaze, unsure if the comment was a compliment or a challenge. "I'm not here to meet your expectations," she replied quietly. "I'm here to figure out where I fit in all of this." Madison studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Fair enough," she said. "But remember, this family comes with its own set of rules. If you choose to be a part of it, you'll have to decide how far you're willing to go to protect it." The words lingered long after Madison walked away, leaving Kiana to grapple with their implications. She knew this life wasn't going to be easy, but the question Madison had posed was one she hadn't fully considered until now. How far was she willing to go? As the evening drew to a close and Andrew led her back to the car, Kiana felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. This world was complicated, ruthless, and filled with shadows she hadn't yet begun to understand. But for the first time since stepping into the Whitmore family's orbit, she felt a spark of something else. Resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the sprawling Whitmore estate. Kiana stood near the edge of the garden, her gaze fixed on the distant treetops as the cool evening breeze teased at the hem of her dress. It had been weeks since the charity event, weeks filled with tension, revelations, and choices she hadn't expected to make. Now, everything had led to this moment, a final confrontation with the truths she'd uncovered and the decisions that would shape her future. Behind her, Andrew approached quietly, his footsteps crunching against the gravel path. "You've been quiet," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Are you sure about this?" Kiana turned to him, her expression calm but resolute. "I need to do this, Andrew. If I don't, I'll always wonder if I made the right choice." Andrew studied her for a moment before nodding. "Whatever happens, I'm with you. You know that, right?" A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I know," she said. "And thank you." Taking a deep breath, Kiana squared her shoulders and turned back toward the mansion. Inside, Madison was waiting in the study, her usual air of authority tempered by an undercurrent of unease. Evelyn was there as well, her posture rigid and her expression a mask of disdain. The tension in the room was palpable as Kiana entered, Andrew at her side. Madison rose from her seat, her sharp gaze settling on Kiana. "You asked to see me," she said, her tone even but cautious. "I assume this is important." Kiana stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "It is," she said. "I've spent weeks trying to understand where I fit in all of this. Your family, your world, and I've come to a decision." The room seemed to hold its breath as Kiana stood at the center, her gaze shifting between Madison and Evelyn. She took another step forward, her voice unwavering. "I'm not here to claim anything," she began, her words deliberate. "I'm not here to take the Whitmore name or rewrite the legacy you've built. What I am here to do is draw a line, a clear one." Madison's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. "And what does that mean, Kiana?" "It means I'm not going to let the past define me," Kiana replied. I'm proud of the life I've lived, the family who raised me, and the person I've become. That doesn't change, no matter where I came from or what name is written on a birth certificate. But I won't let anyone, whether it's Evelyn or anyone else, use my past to control my future." Evelyn scoffed, her mask of composure cracking. "Control your future? Please. You've been playing the victim this entire time, acting like you're above it all, while conveniently reaping the benefits of being a Whitmore." Kiana met Evelyn's glare without flinching. "The only person who's been playing games here is you, Evelyn. You've spent more time trying to tear me down than actually focusing on what matters. But it doesn't work anymore. I see through you, and so does everyone else." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Madison raised a hand, silencing her. "Enough," Madison said firmly, her gaze moving between the two women. "This family has endured enough division. Kiana is right. Our focus needs to be on the future, not on petty infighting." Madison stepped closer to Kiana, her voice softening. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know I have a long way to go to earn your trust. But if you're willing, I'd like to try. To build something new. Together." Kiana hesitated, her emotions warring inside her. But as she looked into Madison's eyes, she saw something genuine, something that felt like hope. "I don't know what the future looks like," Kiana said finally, "but I'm willing to take it one step at a time." Madison nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing her face. "That's all I can ask." As the tension in the room began to ease, Andrew stepped forward, his hand resting on Kiana's back. "You've handled this with more grace than most people could," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Kiana allowed herself a small smile. "I've had good support," she replied, her gaze lingering on him. The rest of the evening passed with quiet resolutions. Evelyn left the room, her defeat clear in her silence, while Madison and Kiana exchanged tentative but meaningful words about what the next steps might look like. By the time Kiana and Andrew stepped out into the cool night air, she felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying had finally been lifted. As they walked down the garden path, Kiana glanced at Andrew, her voice thoughtful. "For the first time in weeks, I feel like I can breathe again." Andrew smiled, his arm slipping around her shoulders. "That's because you've taken control. You're not letting them define you. You're defining yourself." Kiana nodded, her steps steady as they moved forward together. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. She wasn't just Kiana Bennett or Kiana Whitmore. She was both, and she was finally okay with that. And as the glow of the mansion faded behind them, Kiana looked toward the horizon, her heart steady and her future wide open.